Welcome to the war narrative where wars become stories. People often remember Italy in World War II not for winning battles, but for losing them. Jokes are still told today. Mean comments about Italian tanks having more gears for going backward than forward, or soldiers giving up at the first sign of trouble. On the internet, these jokes have turned into lots of memes that make fun of an entire country's war experience. But behind these jokes is a much more complicated story. One that's worth looking at again. We're not trying to excuse failure, but to understand it. Italy didn't enter the war as a big industrial power like Germany or the United States. It wasn't a strong navy and colonial power like Britain either. It entered with big dreams that were way bigger than what it could actually do. The country was led by a man who believed more in putting on a show than in real substance. Benito Mussolini saw himself as the heir to the ancient Roman emperors, a modern Augustus who would bring Italy back to imperial greatness. But his soldiers were ordinary men taken from farms, factories, and fishing villages. They marched into the most mechanized war in history, carrying rifles and wearing boots that belonged to an earlier time. The ridicule attached to Italy's military performance often hides the truth. Italy's failures were less about the courage of its soldiers and more about the system that sent them into battle. Think for a moment about the Italian foot soldiers in 1940. They were poorly equipped, often underfed, and sometimes still carrying weapons designed in World War I. Their nation lacked oil, coal, and steel, basic ingredients for modern war. Their officers were promoted more for being loyal to Mussolini than for being smart about tactics. They trained soldiers to fight the War of 1918, not the War of 1940. Yet Mussolini still rushed Italy into battle. When France was falling under German attack in June 1940, he declared that Italy must strike now before the rewards of victory were divided without him. The invasion of southern France, launched with great fanfare, quickly revealed the truth. Italy's forces couldn't even break through the weakened French lines. Soldiers stumbled forward without enough artillery support. Tanks that could barely withstand rifle fire rolled toward battle. Supply columns broke down in the mountain passes. In just 2 weeks, the myth of Italy's military strength had begun to fall apart. But history is never as simple as a series of jokes. Italy's failures, though often exaggerated for comedy, were rooted in structural problems. Weak industry, poor leadership, and impossible goals. They were also made worse by Mussolini's hunger for fame, which pushed his nation into wars it couldn't sustain. This is why modern historians warn against dismissing Italy's story as just cowardice. Soldiers fought bravely, often in hopeless conditions. Many froze on the Russian steppes, starved in the deserts of North Africa, or endured bombings at home, sacrificing as much as anyone in that dark time. The tragedy of Italy in World War II lies in this contradiction. A people called to fight for a dream that their nation was incapable of achieving. It's a story of pride colliding with reality, of ordinary men caught between loyalty and despair. To laugh at Italy's failures is easy. To understand them requires peeling away the myths, examining the flawed system beneath, and acknowledging the human cost of Mussolini's ambitions. And so, before we dive into the details of military shortages, botched campaigns, and humiliating defeats, we must begin here, with the myth of Italian incompetence and the deeper truth that lies behind it. To understand why Mussolini dragged Italy into a war it wasn't ready for, we must return to the moment when he first seized power in 1922. Italy was a nation still dealing with disappointment. Though it had fought alongside the Allies in World War I and came out technically victorious, Italians called the peace settlement a mutilated victory. They had been promised huge territorial rewards for their sacrifices. Territories along the Adriatic Sea, parts of Asia Minor, even colonies in Africa. But the Treaty of Versailles delivered little. Veterans returned home to find a country bankrupt, unstable, and full of anger. It was in this atmosphere of resentment and uncertainty that Benito Mussolini rose to power. He styled himself not just as a politician, but as the savior of the Italian people. In his speeches, he invoked the glory of ancient Rome. He didn't speak of mere prosperity or stability. He spoke of empire, of Italy as the heir to a civilization that had once ruled the known world. His followers marched in black shirts through the streets, chanting slogans of destiny. To them, Mussolini was not just Il Duce, the leader, but the embodiment of a new Caesar. And Mussolini cultivated this image relentlessly. He posed in dramatic photographs, chest thrust forward, jaw set like a statue carved from Roman marble. He made sure to be filmed striding on a horse, gazing sternly across a balcony, or reviewing his troops beneath ancient ruins. Propaganda posters drew direct connections between the legions of old and the soldiers of fascist Italy. Mussolini wasn't just reviving the state, he was reviving Rome itself. The promise of empire had powerful appeal. Italians had long felt overshadowed by their neighbors. Britain with its globe-spanning territories, France with colonies in Africa and Asia, and now even Germany, which under Hitler spoke openly of its right to conquer. For a nation that still struggled with poverty and underdevelopment, Mussolini's vision of empire was intoxicating. He promised that Italy would no longer beg for scraps at the diplomatic table. Instead, it would seize what it was owed. This dream, however, was always shaky. Italy's economy was fragile, its industry underdeveloped, its military equipment decades behind its rivals. Yet Mussolini's genius lay in making Italians believe that these obstacles could be swept away by sheer willpower and spectacle. His speeches thundered with certainty. His parades dazzled with grandeur. Fascism presented itself as unstoppable, and the people were told to march as though the Mediterranean were already a new Roman lake. Hitler, watching from Germany, encouraged Mussolini's delusions. He even called him one of the Caesars. The words thrilled Mussolini, confirming his belief that history was waiting to be reshaped in his image. But behind the rhetoric and theater, cracks were already forming. For all the triumphal parades and staged photographs, Italy was a nation standing on clay feet. When Mussolini dreamed of empire, he imagined marble columns and imperial banners. What he ignored was coal, oil, steel, and tanks, the materials of modern empire. In the age of industrial war, speeches and symbols couldn't substitute for factories and supply chains. Yet for nearly 2 decades, Mussolini built his power on this dream. And by the late 1930s, he was convinced it was time to act. Italy, he believed, wouldn't just march alongside Hitler. It would carve its own empire across Africa, the Balkans, and the Mediterranean. The world, Mussolini declared, would once again bow to Rome. It was a dream destined to collide with reality. And in that collision, Italy's weakness would be exposed to the world. To understand the disaster that unfolded for Italy during World War II, one must look closely at the man at its center. Benito Mussolini was not a strategist or a general. He was a showman, part actor, part demagogue, who believed that force of personality could bend reality itself. When he looked in the mirror, he didn't see a provincial journalist who had clawed his way into politics. He saw Augustus reborn, a man destined to restore Rome's glory. Mussolini had a gift for theater. He spoke with dramatic pauses, thunderous hand gestures, and a booming voice that filled town squares with electricity. Italians, weary of weak governments and endless strikes, found in him a figure who promised certainty. He cultivated every detail of his public persona. The jutting chin, the broad stance, the carefully staged photographs of him harvesting wheat, flying airplanes, or wielding swords. To his admirers, he seemed tireless, a man of action who lived as he spoke. But behind the spectacle was a restless insecurity. Mussolini feared being irrelevant. His early years had been marked by poverty and rejection. He had once been a radical socialist, then a soldier, and finally a political agitator who saw that nationalism offered him the greatest stage. The grander the promise he made, the more he silenced doubts about his own limitations. Dreams of empire were not only for Italy, they were also for himself, a way to etch his name alongside Caesar and Augustus. This need for fame shaped every decision he made. Mussolini envied Hitler's meteoric rise in Germany. When Hitler annexed Austria and shattered Czechoslovakia, Mussolini looked on with both pride and envy. Pride because he imagined himself Hitler's equal. Envy because he knew Italy lacked the steel, oil, and factories that made Germany powerful. Still, he wouldn't be left behind. Italy's empire, he told his people, would stretch from the Alps to the Horn of Africa, and the Mediterranean would once again be Mare Nostrum, our sea. Yet in private, Mussolini admitted doubts. His marshals reminded him that Italy's armies lacked tanks, artillery, and trucks. Generals like Badoglio urged patience, warning that entering a modern war too soon would be suicide. But Mussolini's ego couldn't wait. He had invested nearly 2 decades in building a myth of invincibility. If Italy remained on the sidelines while Germany conquered Europe, his entire image would collapse. He told himself that boldness was always rewarded, that history favored those who acted decisively. This tension between Mussolini's vanity and Italy's reality would drive the nation into catastrophe. The Duce believed that speeches, parades, and sheer willpower could substitute for logistics and planning. He was convinced that courage alone could make up for outdated rifles or thin-skinned tanks. For him, hesitation was worse than defeat because hesitation exposed weakness. Thus, Mussolini dragged Italy into war not because it was ready, but because he was unwilling to be left behind. In doing so, he gambled not only with his own fame, but with the lives of millions of Italians. The tragedy is that many believed him. They marched beneath banners of Rome reborn, thinking themselves heirs to Caesar, when in truth they were marching into a storm their nation couldn't withstand. When the storm of war finally broke across Europe in September 1939, Mussolini hesitated. Italy, after all, wasn't prepared. Its factories sputtered, its arsenals were half empty, and its generals quietly admitted the nation lacked even the fuel to sustain long campaigns. For a brief moment, Mussolini listened to his advisors, men like Marshal Badoglio, a seasoned officer who warned that entering the war too soon would spell disaster. Another was Italo Balbo, the daring aviator and governor of Libya, who urged caution and time to rearm. Both men understood the cold arithmetic of war. Steel, oil, and supplies would matter more than speeches or parades. But Mussolini was never a patient man. He looked north to Germany and saw Hitler's armies smashing through Poland and France with breathtaking speed. The world seemed to tremble before the Third Reich. And Mussolini feared Italy would miss its chance to share in the spoils. For him, the war wasn't a question of if, but when. He didn't want Italy to be a spectator at the table of victors. He wanted it to arrive as a conqueror, demanding its seat. And so, in June 1940, as France tottered on the brink of collapse under German attack, Mussolini made his move. Against the advice of his marshals, he declared war. He proclaimed that Italy needed only a few thousand dead to secure its share of victory. The words, chilling in their cynicism, revealed how little he valued the lives of his soldiers compared to his own hunger for fame. The Italian invasion of southern France was launched with trumpets and banners. Mussolini imagined a swift triumph, a victorious march into Nice, perhaps even Marseille, that would cement Italy's place as Germany's equal. Yet what followed was a harsh lesson in reality. Italian troops, poorly supplied and ill-prepared, struggled in the Alpine passes. Artillery pieces dragged up winding mountain roads broke down before they could fire a shot. Tanks, lightly armored and undergunned, stalled on the rough terrain. Soldiers trudged forward in summer uniforms, shivering as snowstorms swept over the high peaks. Meanwhile, the French, though already beaten by the Germans in the north, fought fiercely in the south. Their defenses in the Alps had been carefully constructed, and Italian assaults were repelled again and again. The campaign, meant to be Mussolini's grand entry into the war, turned into a humiliation. By the time France surrendered to Germany, Italian gains amounted to little more than a few villages near the border. The world noticed. Germany's lightning-fast victories contrasted sharply with Italy's plodding, ineffective advance. Mussolini had hoped to enter the war as a Caesar. Instead, Italy's first steps were those of a crippled empire in waiting. Behind the facade of fascist strength, the cracks were widening. Yet Mussolini was undeterred. To admit failure was impossible. To retreat into caution was unthinkable. He doubled down, convinced that destiny favored boldness. If France hadn't brought him glory, perhaps the Balkans would. If the Alps had humbled his armies, perhaps the deserts of North Africa would redeem them. Always the dream of empire pushed him forward. and always reality lagged behind. This impatience, this refusal to wait, to prepare, to accept Italy's limits, would become the hallmark of Mussolini's strategy. It was a strategy that demanded speed and spectacle but condemned his nation to repeated humiliation. In chasing triumph, Illinois Duce set Italy on a path where each gamble only deepened its ruin. Italy's failures in 1940 can't be understood without looking at the decade that came before them. Long before Mussolini entered World War II, he had already wasted his nation's strength in a series of costly, poorly thought-out adventures. Each one was meant to prove Italy's imperial might. Each one left the country weaker than before. The first and perhaps most infamous was the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. Mussolini framed it as the fulfillment of Italy's destiny in Africa, avenging the humiliating defeat at Adwa in 1896, when Ethiopian warriors had crushed Italian forces. This time, Mussolini vowed Italy wouldn't be denied. The campaign, waged with overwhelming force including poison gas and modern aircraft against poorly equipped Ethiopian fighters, was a brutal colonial war disguised as a triumph of civilization. Rome celebrated the conquest with parades and banners, but the reality was sobering. The war drained Italy's finances, alienated Britain and France, and forced the League of Nations to impose sanctions that crippled Italian trade. The new empire in East Africa was less a jewel in the crown than a logistical nightmare, demanding constant garrisons, supplies, and suppression of local resistance. Next came Spain. In 1936, Mussolini eagerly intervened in the Spanish Civil War, sending tens of thousands of troops, aircraft, and tanks to support Francisco Franco. He saw it as both a proving ground for fascist ideology and a chance to bind Italy closer to Nazi Germany. The war dragged on for 3 years, bleeding Italy of resources. Italian troops fought bravely in battles like Guadalajara, but their defeats were stark, exposing weaknesses in training and equipment that Mussolini chose to ignore. While Franco eventually triumphed, the victory was Franco's, not Mussolini's. Italy had paid dearly in blood and treasure, gaining little more than hollow prestige. Then came Albania in 1939, a small and swift invasion that Mussolini staged largely to imitate Hitler's dramatic seizure of Austria and Czechoslovakia. Italy's forces overwhelmed Albania in days, but the conquest brought no meaningful strategic advantage. Instead, it became another drain on Italy's already strained supply lines and manpower. By the time World War II began, Italy had already stretched itself thin. Its armies were scattered across colonies in Africa and Europe. Its economy was weakened by sanctions and overspending. Its arsenals were depleted by years of fighting wars that brought little reward. Mussolini, however, saw only the glory. In his mind, Ethiopia had restored Roman pride, Spain had proven Italy's martial spirit, and Albania had confirmed his image as a conqueror. What he ignored was that each of these ventures had eaten away at Italy's ability to wage the real war that was coming. Factories couldn't produce modern weapons quickly enough. Soldiers marched with rifles that had already seen action a generation earlier. Oil and coal were in short supply, forcing commanders to ration fuel long before campaigns began. Thus, when Mussolini pushed Italy into war in 1940, he was drawing from a nation that had already spent its strength. The victories he boasted of in Ethiopia, Spain, and Albania hadn't built a new Rome. They had hollowed one out. Italy entered the global conflict carrying not only the weight of Mussolini's ambitions, but also the burden of his reckless past. If Mussolini's vision of empire was built on shaky foundations, nowhere was this more evident than in the leadership of his armed forces. The Italian high command in the late 1930s was less a council of seasoned strategists than a court of flatterers and political loyalists. Merit counted for little. Loyalty to Mussolini counted for everything. Marshal Badoglio, for instance, owed his position less to brilliance on the battlefield and more to his careful balancing act of supporting the regime while avoiding Mussolini's jealousy. Others rose even faster by being ardent fascists rather than competent soldiers. This politicization of the officer corps was disastrous. Instead of a hierarchy shaped by experience and merit, Italy's army was guided by men who often had no understanding of modern warfare. Historians like MacGregor Knox have observed that this system created a culture where failure was hidden and innovation stifled. Officers were reluctant to challenge outdated doctrines for fear of appearing disloyal. Promotions were handed to men who agreed with Mussolini's fantasies rather than those who warned of logistical realities. In such an atmosphere, truth became dangerous. Generals who raised concerns about shortages or obsolete equipment were accused of defeatism. Those who painted rosy pictures, no matter how false, were rewarded. The results were catastrophic. Many senior officers still clung to tactics born in World War I, where the army had been bled dry at battles like Caporetto and the Piave. They trained soldiers for trench assaults and static defense, even as the German blitzkrieg demonstrated that speed, armor, and mechanization defined modern war. Italy's forces, as a result, marched into battle with one foot still planted firmly in 1918. Political patronage seeped into every level. Local fascist officials interfered with recruitment and supply, often prioritizing loyalty over competence. Some commanders were chosen not because they had led divisions effectively, but because they had demonstrated their devotion during Mussolini's rallies or colonial wars. The army became an extension of the regime's propaganda machine, an institution meant to glorify fascism rather than to win wars. For the ordinary soldier, this meant confusion and inconsistency. Orders often shifted abruptly, reflecting Mussolini's latest whim rather than a coherent strategy. Planning for long-term campaigns was nearly impossible because leaders feared contradicting Il Duce. Morale, already strained by poor equipment and shortages, was further eroded by a sense that their commanders cared more about impressing Mussolini than protecting their men. This rot at the top wasn't unique to Italy. Other nations had their share of political appointees. But in Italy, the problem was particularly severe. Where Germany had a tradition of professional staff officers and Britain maintained an experienced officer corps, Italy's command was riddled with mediocrity elevated by political loyalty. In effect, Mussolini had shackled his army to his own vanity. And yet, it would be wrong to dismiss all Italian officers as incompetent. Some, like Giovanni Mess in North Africa, proved themselves capable when given proper resources. Others tried desperately to modernize training or equipment but were ignored. The tragedy is that such men were often sidelined, their efforts undone by a system that rewarded obedience to Mussolini over competence in war. Thus, even before Italy's soldiers faced their enemies on the battlefield, they were already betrayed by the structure of their own command. In a war where leadership and adaptability would mean the difference between survival and destruction, Mussolini's army marched forward guided less by strategy than by politics. And the cost would be paid in blood. Italy's generals marched into World War II carrying the baggage of the last war. Their doctrines, strategies, and assumptions were rooted in the trenches of the Great War, not in the realities of blitzkrieg. They had endured the carnage of Caporetto and the Piave, where artillery barrages and mass infantry assaults defined victory or defeat. But instead of learning adaptability, many clung stubbornly to what they knew, even as the world of warfare changed around them. The result was an army trained for a war that no longer existed. Italian officers drilled their men in static defenses, bayonet charges, and set-piece assaults that might have made sense in 1917 but were hopelessly outdated in 1940. Soldiers were issued manuals and training regimens that emphasized close-order formations and positional warfare, while their adversaries raced ahead with tanks, mechanized infantry, and air support. To put it simply, Italy was preparing its troops for yesterday's battles. The equipment reflected the mindset. Artillery was often decades old, prone to misfires and mechanical failure. Infantry weapons lagged far behind those of their enemies. The Carcano rifle, newly adopted, was already seen as inferior in range and stopping power, forcing some divisions to revert to World War I-era rifles that jammed in the field. Even the structure of divisions was shaped by outdated thinking. Mussolini's binary system, which reduced divisions to 2 regiments instead of 3, was sold as a way to increase mobility. In reality, it weakened combat strength and left units brittle against sustained assaults. One must imagine the emotional toll on the average soldier. Young conscripts, barely trained, were marched into battles armed with weapons their fathers might have carried a generation earlier. Tanks meant to spearhead offensives were thinly armored death traps, vulnerable even to small-caliber anti-tank rifles. Pilots climbed into biplanes that looked as though they belonged in a museum, not the skies of 1940. To fight in Mussolini's army was to fight with the ghosts of the past. And yet, this wasn't because Italians lacked bravery. Time and again, individual soldiers demonstrated resilience, improvisation, and courage. The failure was systemic, not human. Leaders who had seen the horror of 1915 to 18 recoiled from innovation, clinging instead to familiar methods. They trained their men for trench warfare on a battlefield that had become fluid, mechanized, and unforgiving. Historians have noted the bitter irony. Mussolini dreamed of reviving the Roman legions, but his generals had revived Verdun and Caporetto instead. They imagined slow, grinding campaigns of attrition, but World War II offered no time for that. Victories were now measured in days, not years, and armies that failed to adapt were swept aside with shocking speed. In this sense, Italy was not only outmatched by its enemies but also trapped by its own past. The memory of World War I lingered over every decision, every training manual, every deployment. The dead of Caporetto and the Piave whispered strategies from their graves, and Mussolini's officers listened. But when the test came in 1940, those ghosts offered no guidance, only chains that bound Italy to failure. Grand speeches and parades may inspire, but wars are won with steel, fuel, and factories. Here lay one of Italy's deepest weaknesses. Its industrial base was simply incapable of sustaining a modern war. Mussolini could dream of empire all he wished, but Italy lacked the means to build it. Consider the numbers. By 1940, Italian infantry divisions were short an estimated 15,000 artillery pieces. Yet the nation's factories could only produce about 8% of that number in a single year. What artillery did reach the front was often defective. Barrels warped after only a few dozen rounds, breeches jammed, and ammunition misfired. Infantry rifles, too, suffered from reliability issues. Soldiers often swapped the new Carcano for older, sturdier models from World War I. Hardly a vote of confidence in Italy's modern armament. Tanks told the same story. The Fiat L3 tankettes, little more than armored boxes with machine guns, were woefully inadequate against even the lightest Allied armor. Later models like the M11/39 and M13/40 offered slight improvements. But they were still thin-skinned, undergunned, and prone to mechanical failure. Italian crews faced British Matildas and Crusaders with vehicles that barely deserved the name tank. It wasn't cowardice that made them retreat. It was survival. Aircraft production fared no better. Italy had some innovative designs, sleek fighters like the Macchi C.202 or bombers like the Savoy Marchetti SM.79. But production was slow and inconsistent. Worse still, Italy manufactured dozens of aircraft types simultaneously, scattering resources and complicating logistics. By September 1939, less than half of the Regia Aeronautica's planes were operational. Many squadrons still flew biplanes, relics in a world dominated by Hurricanes, Spitfires, and Messerschmitts. Behind these failures lay Italy's fundamental economic limitations. Unlike Germany, Italy lacked coal and iron deposits. Unlike Britain, it didn't command vast colonial networks to feed its factories. Even oil had to be imported, leaving Mussolini at the mercy of German shipments and vulnerable supply lines across the Mediterranean. Italy's industrial heartlands in the north, around Turin and Milan, could produce luxury cars and fine textiles. But mass production of modern weapons of war was beyond their scale. The irony was bitter. Mussolini had built an ideology on the myth of strength, but his empire stood on an economy closer to that of a second-tier power. Italy couldn't match the output of its allies, let alone its enemies. Britain alone outproduced Italy in aircraft, artillery, and naval construction year after year. When American industry entered the war, the disparity became almost absurd. The United States produced more tanks in a single year than Italy did in the entire conflict. For the ordinary soldier, this industrial weakness wasn't an abstract statistic. It was a daily reality. It meant going into battle with too few shells, too little fuel, or a rifle that jammed when it was needed most. It meant divisions left immobile for lack of trucks, airfields with grounded planes for lack of spare parts, and armored regiments that were armored in name only. Mussolini's dream of empire might have inspired Italians to march, but without industry, those dreams had no teeth. A nation can't fight modern war on propaganda alone. The battlefield would soon prove this truth as Italian soldiers, brave but ill-equipped, were pitted against enemies whose arsenals dwarfed their own. Even if Italy's factories had been more efficient, they would still have been strangled by the absence of what every modern army requires: resources. Steel, coal, and above all oil, the lifeblood of mechanized warfare, were in desperately short supply. Italy had ambitions of empire, but it lacked the raw materials to fuel one. Geography was both a blessing and a curse. Italy's position at the heart of the Mediterranean seemed ideal for domination of sea routes. Mussolini liked to boast that the Mediterranean was Mare Nostrum, echoing the Romans. Yet this sea was also a trap. The narrow straits of Gibraltar and Suez were controlled by Britain, leaving Italian shipping vulnerable. Enemy fleets and submarines prowled the waters, cutting off access to vital imports. Italy couldn't produce enough oil at home, nor did it control the coal reserves needed to run its industry. Even before the war began, Italy imported much of its energy. Once the war disrupted trade, shortages became crippling. Oil was the greatest weakness. Without it, tanks couldn't move, planes couldn't fly, and ships couldn't sail. Germany provided shipments, but Hitler prioritized his own war machine, leaving Italy with the scraps. North Africa, where Mussolini dreamed of expansion, offered little relief. Libya yielded barely a drop of petroleum. Italian commanders often found themselves rationing fuel, keeping vehicles idle for lack of supplies. Pilots sat grounded while British squadrons roared overhead. Entire naval operations were cancelled because there simply wasn't enough oil to launch them. Coal was scarcely better. Lacking domestic reserves, Italy relied heavily on imports, often from Germany or the Balkans. Any disruption to these supply lines had immediate effects, slowing production and stranding locomotives. Italian railways, already overstretched, buckled under the strain. Soldiers on the front were left waiting for supplies that never arrived, a frustration that eroded morale as much as hunger and exhaustion. Even food, so often overlooked in military histories, became a strategic liability. Italy could feed itself in peacetime, but war disrupted agriculture. Manpower drained from the countryside into the army, while imports of grain and fertilizer dwindled. Rations shrank both for civilians and for soldiers. The propaganda of abundance, the endless wheat harvests Mussolini loved to pose beside, couldn't conceal the reality of hunger. This fragility shaped every campaign. In North Africa, Italian armored divisions could outnumber the British on paper, but many of their vehicles never reached the battlefield because of fuel shortages. In the Balkans, supply columns bogged down not only by terrain but by lack of reliable transport. Even the proud Italian navy, with sleek cruisers and powerful battleships, was reduced to idling in harbors when oil ran out. The curse of resources meant that Italy fought World War II with one hand tied behind its back. Its leaders dreamed of empire, but they lacked the material foundations that Britain drew from its colonies or that Germany seized through conquest. The Italian soldier, sent to fight in deserts, mountains, and seas, carried the weight of this scarcity on his back. He wasn't defeated for lack of bravery, but for lack of the coal to fire his artillery, the oil to fuel his tank, the bread to sustain his march. In the end, Mussolini's greatest delusion was believing that sheer willpower could overcome these shortages. But war in the 20th century wasn't won by speeches or parades. It was won by barrels of oil, tons of steel, and mountains of coal. And in all these, Italy was desperately poor. If there was one branch of Mussolini's armed forces that seemed to promise real strength, it was the Regia Marina, the Royal Italian Navy. Unlike the army, which stumbled into battle with outdated rifles and fragile tanks, the Navy appeared modern, sleek, and formidable. Its fleet of destroyers, cruisers, battleships, and submarines was one of the largest in Europe. To many Italians, it was the pride of their nation, the one arm of service that might turn Mussolini's dream of a new Roman lake in the Mediterranean into reality. On paper, the numbers impressed. Italy possessed more destroyers, torpedo boats, and submarines in the Mediterranean than either Britain or France. Its warships were beautifully engineered, often faster and more elegant than their counterparts. The Littorio-class battleships, launched in the late 1930s, were symbols of prestige, their massive guns and sleek lines reflecting Mussolini's desire to project power. In parades and propaganda films, the Navy gleamed as the embodiment of Italy's modern strength. Yet even here, promise faltered before reality. For all its numbers and engineering, the Regia Marina was crippled by shortages of the same resources that plagued the rest of Italy's war effort. Chief among them was oil. A battleship consumed thousands of tons of fuel on a single mission. Without steady supplies, Italy's proud fleet often sat idle in port, unable to deploy at full strength. Commanders sometimes had to ration operations, sending only part of their forces to sea. The Mediterranean may have been Mussolini's lake, but without oil, his ships couldn't sail across it. Air cover was another fatal weakness. Modern naval warfare demanded coordination with powerful air forces. Germany's Luftwaffe understood this, and Britain's Royal Navy benefited from the protection of the RAF. Italy's Regia Aeronautica, however, was fragmented and unreliable. Italian ships sailed with little or no air support, leaving them vulnerable to Allied bombers and reconnaissance. This imbalance turned the Mediterranean into a deadly arena. While Italian warships fought bravely, sometimes scoring sharp tactical victories, the lack of fuel and air protection meant they couldn't turn these into lasting strategic gains. And yet, to dismiss the Regia Marina as ineffective would be unfair. The sailors fought with skill and courage. Italian submarines, for instance, played a significant role in the Battle of the Atlantic alongside their German allies, sinking Allied shipping even far from home waters. Italian torpedo bombers, flying the trimotor SM.79, became feared opponents, sinking or damaging several British warships. There were moments of brilliance that showed what Italy's navy might have achieved under different circumstances. But the tragedy of the Italian navy mirrors the tragedy of Mussolini's entire war effort, potential undone by limitations. Ships designed for glory languished for want of oil. Bold admirals planned daring operations only to see them fail because aircraft were grounded or fuel tanks stood empty. Sailors trained for decisive battles but often found themselves trapped in indecision, their fleet preserved in port rather than risked in open battle. In the end, the Regia Marina symbolized Italy's paradox in World War II. It was modern yet starved, impressive yet constrained, a force that seemed powerful until tested by the relentless demands of modern mechanized warfare. For Mussolini, it remained a showpiece, a way to claim prestige at parades and in propaganda. But when the fate of empire was at stake, even his proud navy couldn't tip the balance of war. If the Italian navy stood as Mussolini's proudest boast, the Air Force Regia Aeronautica was his most glaring weakness. In theory, it was meant to be the symbol of modernity, the winged spearhead of a new Roman Empire. Mussolini often used it in propaganda, showcasing sleek aircraft in air shows, their formations spelling out the fascist symbol across the skies. To Italians on the ground, it seemed like proof that their nation had finally entered the modern age. But when war came, that illusion shattered quickly. The problems began with numbers. At the outbreak of war in September 1939, less than half of Italy's aircraft were serviceable. The others languished in hangars, missing spare parts, or crippled by maintenance issues. Pilots, desperate to keep their squadrons airborne, scavenged parts from one machine to keep another flying. Even the planes that did make it into the sky were often outdated. Incredibly, many Italian pilots were still flying biplanes, canvas and wire designs that belonged to World War I, against the Spitfires and Hurricanes of the British RAF. Diversity of models compounded the chaos. Unlike Britain or Germany, which streamlined production to focus on a handful of reliable designs, Italy manufactured dozens of different aircraft types simultaneously. Each required different parts, different engines, different maintenance procedures. This scattershot approach strained Italy's already weak industry and made supplying squadrons a logistical nightmare. In some cases, Mechanics on the front lines faced hangars filled with half-broken planes they had no tools or spare parts to repair. And yet, Italian aviation wasn't without talent. Engineers produced some innovative designs, fighters like the Macchi C.202 Folgore, which could hold its own against Allied aircraft when it finally entered service, or the trimotor Savoia Marchetti SM.79, which became one of the most effective torpedo bombers of the war. But these successes were undermined by delays, small production runs, and lack of coordination. By the time Italy fielded its best machines, the Allies had already deployed newer and stronger aircraft in greater numbers. The human cost of this disorganization fell squarely on the pilots. Many flew bravely into hopeless encounters, their outdated planes little more than targets. Accounts survive of Italian aviators taking off in slow, flimsy biplanes only to be met by swarms of faster, better-armed enemy fighters. Losses were heavy, morale brittle. Pilots did what they could, sometimes diving into clouds to escape pursuit, sometimes attempting suicidal maneuvers to bring down an enemy. But courage alone couldn't overcome technological inferiority. Coordination with the other services was just as dire. Italian generals had little understanding of how to integrate air power into modern combined arms warfare. Ground forces often attacked without air cover, while the Navy sailed without reconnaissance or fighter support. Mussolini liked to boast that Italy's air force was among the strongest in Europe. But the truth was that it operated more like three competing branches: the fighter squadrons, the bomber groups, and the torpedo wings, each pursuing its own objectives with little cooperation. Thus, the Regia Aeronautica, intended as a gleaming emblem of fascist modernity, became instead a symbol of Italy's broader wartime failures. Fragmented, under-equipped, and stretched beyond its limits. Like the Army and Navy, it was asked to fight a modern war with inadequate tools. Like them, it produced moments of heroism and ingenuity that stand out against the larger backdrop of dysfunction. And like them, it revealed the fatal gap between Mussolini's dream of empire and the material reality of his nation. Behind every grand strategy and every boastful speech stood the ordinary Italian infantryman, the backbone of Mussolini's armies and the one who bore the brunt of Italy's unpreparedness. For all the mockery directed at Italy's wartime record, it is here, in the lived experience of these soldiers, that the true tragedy emerges. By 1940, only about a quarter of Italy's divisions had sufficient weapons, equipment, and rations. The rest went to war with shortages so severe that units were sometimes left without artillery support, anti-tank weapons, or even adequate boots. Soldiers carried the Carcano rifle, a weapon infamous for its limited range and frequent jamming. Many veterans quietly preferred the older rifles from World War I, despite their age, because they were sturdier and more reliable. The difference could mean life or death on the battlefield. Food, too, was a constant problem. Italian supply chains buckled under the strain of war, and men often marched hungry. Rations were meager, consisting of bread, cheese, and sometimes a thin soup. Fresh meat or vegetables were luxuries. In desert campaigns, where heat and thirst tested endurance beyond measure, the lack of food and water became as deadly as enemy fire. Soldiers nicknamed their meals La Fame Nera, the Black Hunger. Transport was another weakness. While their German allies sped across Europe in mechanized convoys, Italian divisions were largely non-motorized. Men and supplies still moved by horse-drawn carts, a throwback to the 19th century. When Mussolini introduced the binary system, reducing divisions from 3 regiments to 2, it was touted as an innovation that would increase mobility. In reality, it diluted the fighting strength of each division while doing nothing to solve the lack of trucks, fuel, or spare parts. And yet, despite these shortcomings, many Italian soldiers fought with courage. In the frozen steppes of Russia, they endured temperatures that froze rifles solid, digging trenches with bare hands when shovels ran out. In North Africa, they faced sandstorms, thirst, and relentless British counterattacks, often holding their ground until collapse. Even in Greece, where terrain and weather conspired against them, men pressed forward in snow and mud, their uniforms in tatters, clinging to the hope that their sacrifices wouldn't be in vain. But bravery alone couldn't compensate for systemic failure. Time and again, Italian units broke not because they lacked heart, but because they were abandoned by poor planning, outdated equipment, and inadequate supplies. Morale eroded as soldiers realized their sacrifices were squandered by leaders who cared more about Mussolini's prestige than their survival. Letters from the front reveal a deep sense of disillusionment. Men writing home not of glory or empire, but of hunger, exhaustion, and the longing to see their families again. This is the paradox of Italy's war effort. The soldiers themselves were no less human, no less capable of courage than those of any other nation. What failed them was the system that armed them with relics, starved them of supplies, and commanded them with arrogance and incompetence. When history remembers them as the butt of jokes, it obscures the truth that countless Italian soldiers endured the same hardships, fears, and sacrifices as their counterparts in every army. The difference was that they were sent into battle already betrayed by the nation that asked for their lives. If Mussolini's ambitions had a stage, it was North Africa. Here, in the vast deserts stretching across Libya and into Egypt, Illinois Duce hoped to carve out an empire that would rival Rome's. He boasted of pushing the British out of Egypt, seizing the Suez Canal, and turning the Mediterranean into an Italian lake. On paper, the odds seemed favorable. In 1940, Italian forces in Libya outnumbered the British 10-1. Yet once again, numbers proved an illusion. The desert was unforgiving. Italian soldiers, already poorly supplied in Europe, were sent into conditions for which they were utterly unprepared. Vehicles broke down in the heat. Tanks, thinly armored and undergunned, were no match for the British Matilda II, whose heavy armor turned Italian shells into sparks. Supply convoys stretched across hundreds of miles of sand, vulnerable to raids and air attacks. Water was scarce, food even scarcer, and morale shrank under the weight of exhaustion and thirst. In September 1940, Marshal Graziani launched Italy's invasion of Egypt. It began with pomp and ceremony. Columns of troops marching across the desert, flags raised high, Mussolini confident that destiny was at hand. But within weeks, the offensive stalled. Italian forces advanced only about 60 miles before grinding to a halt at Sidi Barani. They had neither the logistics nor the will to push further. Graziani, cautious and aware of his army's weakness, entrenched his troops in defensive camps rather than risk annihilation. The British, though vastly outnumbered, seized the initiative. In December, General Archibald Wavell launched Operation Compass with just 30,000 men. What followed was a rout. British armored columns cut through the desert like blades, striking Italian camps one by one. The Italians, lacking mobility and coordination, crumbled under the assault. By February 1941, over 130,000 Italian soldiers had been taken prisoner, along with hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces. What Mussolini had imagined as a march to the Nile became one of the most humiliating defeats of the war. For the men captured in those desert battles, the humiliation was deeply personal. Many had fought bravely, holding their ground as long as they could, only to be overwhelmed by superior tactics and equipment. Yet, in the propaganda of the Allies, the narrative became one of Italian cowardice. Photos of long columns of prisoners trudging through the sand with their hands raised reinforced the stereotype that Italians surrendered at the first shot. Few stopped to ask whether these men had ever been given a fighting chance. The North African campaign exposed the hollow core of Mussolini's empire. His dreams of seizing the Suez Canal evaporated in the desert wind, replaced by the grim reality that Italy couldn't hold even what it already possessed. The mirage of empire shimmered for a moment in the heat, only to dissolve under the weight of inadequate logistics, poor leadership, and outdated equipment. Yet North Africa also marked the beginning of a new dependency. The disaster forced Mussolini to call for German help, and soon the Africa Corps, led by Erwin Rommel, arrived to stabilize the front. Italy's supposed war of conquest had become another stage on which Germany played the starring role while Italian troops once again carried the burden of Mussolini's pride. If the deserts of North Africa had shown the limits of Mussolini's ambitions, the mountains of Greece would expose them even more brutally. The campaign began not out of necessity, but out of vanity. Mussolini had grown jealous of Hitler's lightning victories in Western Europe and was determined to stage a triumph of his own. In October 1940, without consulting Berlin, he launched an invasion of Greece from Italian-occupied Albania. He imagined it would be a swift conquest, a matter of weeks before Italian troops would be parading through Athens. Instead, disaster struck almost immediately. The Greek terrain was treacherous. Steep mountains, narrow passes, and sudden storms that turned paths into torrents of mud. Italian soldiers, dressed in thin uniforms suited for the Mediterranean, now shivered in freezing rain and snow. Their supply lines faltered. Food and ammunition failed to reach the front. Tanks bogged down in rough terrain, useless on the mountain roads. But the Greeks were far from the pushover Mussolini expected. United in defense of their homeland, they launched fierce counterattacks. With remarkable resilience, they pushed the Italians not only out of northern Greece but back into Albania itself. Villages that Mussolini had hoped to claim were instead filled with retreating Italian troops, demoralized and exhausted. The world, watching, saw not a conquering empire but a faltering force unable to subdue a much smaller opponent. Hitler was furious. The Greek campaign forced Germany to divert resources from its planned invasion of the Soviet Union, delaying Operation Barbarossa by critical weeks. German troops had to intervene in April 1941, sweeping into Greece and Yugoslavia in a lightning campaign that quickly succeeded where Mussolini had failed. Italian pride was further battered as German soldiers marched through Athens while Italians trailed behind as junior partners in their own war. For the men on the ground, the humiliation was bitter. Letters from Italian soldiers revealed despair at being sent into conditions for which they were unprepared and commanded by officers who seemed more concerned with Mussolini's image than their survival. "We are fighting the mountains more than the enemy," one wrote, summing up the futility of their struggle. The consequences were far-reaching. Mussolini's reckless invasion tied down German divisions in the Balkans, draining resources that Hitler had intended for Russia. Strategists later speculated that this delay, though only weeks, contributed to the Wehrmacht's failure to capture Moscow before the onset of winter. In this sense, Mussolini's blunder in Greece may have altered the course of the entire war, though certainly not in the way he intended. Thus, the Balkan adventure stands as one of Mussolini's greatest humiliations. It was a war begun for prestige, fought without preparation, and ended only by German intervention. The supposed heir to Caesar had not only failed to conquer a small neighbor, but had endangered his alliance with Hitler and revealed once again the fragility of his empire. The mountains of Greece, like the sands of North Africa, became another graveyard for Mussolini's delusions. Italy's alliance with Nazi Germany was supposed to elevate Mussolini's empire, binding it to Hitler's unstoppable momentum. In reality, it exposed the imbalance between the two dictators and revealed Italy's position not as an equal partner but as a burdensome subordinate. Mussolini liked to boast of the Pact of Steel signed in 1939, which promised mutual military support between Rome and Berlin. To the Italian public, it seemed a union of equals, two fascist empires remaking Europe side by side. To Hitler, however, it was clear from the start. Mussolini's Italy was the weaker partner. The early campaigns made this painfully obvious. In France, Greece, and North Africa, Italian failures forced Germany to intervene repeatedly. Each time, Mussolini had imagined quick, glorious conquests. Each time, Hitler had to send German divisions to rescue Italian armies from collapse. In private, Hitler expressed contempt for Mussolini's rashness and the ineffectiveness of Italian forces. He considered his ally a liability, useful for geography but unreliable in war. And geography was Italy's true contribution. Its peninsula stretched like a dagger into the Mediterranean, offering bases for submarines, bombers, and convoys. Its colonies in North Africa provided a foothold near the Suez Canal. Its control of the Balkans, though shaky, secured Germany's southern flank. Strategically, Mussolini's empire mattered, but only insofar as it gave Hitler access to terrain and staging grounds. The fighting strength of Italy's armies was another matter entirely. German commanders, hardened veterans of Blitzkrieg, often looked down on their Italian counterparts. They complained that Italian divisions lacked discipline, modern equipment, and reliable leadership. Rommel, arriving in North Africa to lead the Africa Corps, quickly realized that he couldn't rely on Italian armor. He praised individual Italian units that fought with bravery, particularly the Folgore paratroopers at El Alamein, but his overall assessment was grim. Without German support, he believed Italy would have been swept from the desert entirely. The relationship between Mussolini and Hitler was equally unbalanced. Mussolini admired Hitler, even envied him, but he also feared being overshadowed. He wanted Italy to stand as an empire equal to Germany. Yet each failure deepened his dependence on Berlin. Hitler, meanwhile, tolerated Mussolini's blunders so long as they didn't threaten his grand strategy. But as Italy stumbled from one defeat to another, the Reich had to spend ever more resources propping up its faltering ally. For the Italian soldier, this alliance often meant humiliation. They fought and bled, but victories were claimed by the Germans while defeats were blamed on them. Propaganda in both Britain and Germany mocked Italian performance, reinforcing the idea that they were little more than auxiliaries. To march beside the Wehrmacht was to be constantly reminded of Italy's shortcomings. The irony is sharp. Mussolini entered the war to secure a place at the table of victors, to prove that Italy wasn't a junior power but a new Rome. Instead, his alliance with Hitler revealed the opposite. Italy became dependent, its campaigns overshadowed, its failures magnified. The Pact of Steel was less a bond of equals than a chain that bound Mussolini's fate to Hitler's, dragging Italy deeper into a war it couldn't win. While Mussolini strutted across balconies and dreamed of empire, the Italian people themselves lived in a far different reality. Unlike in Germany, where Hitler's rule was met with mass enthusiasm, fascism in Italy never penetrated as deeply into society. Italians could cheer Mussolini in public rallies, wave flags, and chant slogans, but beneath the surface, popular support was shallow. The Duce had power, yes, but he never commanded the same fervent devotion as his German counterpart. William Shirer, in The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, argued that this lack of genuine support was one of the central weaknesses of Mussolini's regime. Italians, he wrote, never truly embraced fascism. They tolerated it, endured it, even participated in it, but often out of necessity rather than conviction. The reality of daily life made the regime's promises of greatness feel hollow. Wages stagnated, food grew scarce, and propaganda rang increasingly false as defeats mounted abroad. In the cities, rationing and shortages gnawed at morale. Families queued for bread that was thin and tasteless, stretched with chestnut flour or other substitutes. Olive oil and meat were luxuries many households went without. Bombings added another layer of misery, sending families into shelters as Allied planes pounded industrial centers like Turin and Milan. Mussolini had promised a rebirth of empire, but ordinary Italians found themselves enduring hunger and fear. In the countryside, peasants bore their own burdens. Sons were conscripted, leaving farms undermanned. Fields went untended, harvests shrank, and taxes rose to fund Mussolini's wars. Many rural Italians, far from the rallies and propaganda of Rome, felt only the absence of their menfolk and the weight of scarcity. The new Roman Empire meant little to them beyond suffering. And yet, Italians were not passive. Resistance brewed quietly, even before 1943. Whispers of discontent passed in cafes and kitchens. Underground groups began to form, often led by socialists, communists, or Catholics disillusioned with fascism. Even within the army, soldiers wrote letters home filled with doubt and bitterness, questioning why they were dying in distant deserts or frozen steppes for a cause that seemed meaningless. This divergence between regime and people widened as the war dragged on. Mussolini projected confidence, promising victories that never came. Each failure, France, North Africa, Greece, strained the patience of a population already skeptical. Unlike Germany, where Hitler's grip only tightened as the war deepened, Mussolini's support crumbled. Italians grew weary of sacrifice without reward, of defeats explained away by propaganda that few still believed. By 1943, the gap was undeniable. The regime had promised a new Rome but instead delivered ruin. Ordinary Italians, who had never truly embraced fascism with their hearts, were ready to turn away from it altogether. This fragility at home would prove decisive when the Allies landed in Sicily, toppling Mussolini's image of invincibility and revealing just how little foundation his regime truly had. The failure wasn't just military, it was social. Mussolini had built an empire of symbols and rhetoric, but he had never built an empire in the minds of his people. When the moment of crisis came, that lack of belief would make all the difference. By 1943, Mussolini's grand illusion was crumbling. The defeats in North Africa and the Balkans had drained Italy of men and morale, while Allied bombers hammered the industrial heartlands. Cities like Milan, Turin, and Genoa shook under waves of destruction, their factories in ruins, their populations huddled in fear. Bread grew scarcer, oil was gone, and faith in Il Duce had withered into resentment. Italy, once promised empire, now felt only hunger and despair. The blow came in July 1943. The Allies landed in Sicily, and resistance was weaker than even they expected. Italian troops, exhausted and demoralized, abandoned positions or surrendered in droves. Civilians, weary of war, often welcomed the invaders as liberators rather than enemies. Mussolini's propaganda machine tried to spin the disaster as temporary, but no one believed it anymore. Within days, the once vaunted defenses of the island collapsed. In Rome, panic rippled through the fascist leadership. Even the Grand Council of Fascism, Mussolini's own creation, turned against him. On July 25, 1943, he was summoned to the king's residence. Expecting a meeting, Mussolini instead found himself dismissed, arrested by royal guards and quietly removed from power. The man who had strutted as a Caesar for 2 decades was now a prisoner, his empire unraveling. Italy itself fractured. The new government, led by Marshal Badoglio, signed an armistice with the Allies in September. But rather than peace, this brought chaos. German forces swiftly occupied northern and central Italy, disarming Italian units and treating their former allies as traitors. Tens of thousands of Italian soldiers were deported to labor camps in Germany. Many resisted only to be executed. Mussolini was rescued by German commandos in a daring raid and installed as the puppet leader of the so-called Italian Social Republic in the north. But the authority he once wielded was gone. His regime existed only under the shadow of German bayonets. Meanwhile, in the south, the Kingdom of Italy fought alongside the Allies, sending troops against their former comrades. Italy was now a nation at war with itself. For ordinary Italians, the years that followed were brutal. A civil war raged between fascists and partisans. Villages were burned in reprisals, civilians massacred, families torn apart by loyalty to different sides. Hunger deepened, bombings continued, and trust in leaders, both old and new, remained fragile. The dream of empire had shattered into the nightmare of occupation and civil strife. By 1945, Mussolini's fate mirrored that of his country. Captured by partisans as he tried to flee toward Switzerland, he was executed, his body displayed to the jeering crowds in Milan. The man who once declared himself heir to Rome ended not with parades but with a lynching, his corpse hanging in a public square as a symbol of betrayal and ruin. Italy's collapse was complete. A nation that had entered the war chasing the shadow of empire ended it occupied, divided, and devastated. Mussolini had promised glory, but what he delivered was humiliation and civil war. For Italians, the dream of the new Rome died not with the thunder of victory but with the quiet, bitter knowledge of defeat. The war ended, but the shadow of Mussolini's ambitions lingered long after. Italy emerged from World War II not as a reborn empire but as a broken nation. Its cities scarred by bombings, its economy in ruins, and its people disillusioned. The humiliation was deep. Once promised Mare Nostrum, Italians instead saw their navy scuttled, their colonies stripped away, and their land occupied by foreign armies. The dream of empire had dissolved into rubble. Yet the story of Italy's wartime experience is more complicated than the caricature of cowardice that endures in popular memory. The mockery, jokes about tanks with more reverse gears than forward or soldiers who surrendered at the first shot, oversimplifies a far more tragic reality. Italian soldiers did fight, often bravely, in conditions that would have tested any army. The Falgor paratroopers at El Alamein held their ground against overwhelming British assaults. Italian Alpine troops froze on the Russian front, digging in alongside German units until the retreat became unavoidable. Sailors of the Regia Marina risked their lives in daring torpedo runs against Allied fleets. Their sacrifices deserve to be remembered not as a punchline but as testimony to courage betrayed by circumstance. The true failure lay in leadership and preparation. Mussolini built his regime on spectacle and illusion, ignoring the material foundations of modern warfare: oil, coal, steel, and industry. He entered the conflict out of vanity and impatience, gambling with his nation's future to avoid being overshadowed by Hitler. His marshals, chosen for loyalty rather than competence, commanded armies with outdated tactics and broken supply lines. The Italian state, hollowed out by years of mismanaged wars in Ethiopia, Spain, and Albania, simply lacked the capacity to sustain a global conflict. For historians, the lesson of fascist Italy is one of hubris. It shows what happens when ambition outruns ability, when propaganda replaces planning, and when a leader mistakes dreams for reality. Italy didn't fail because its people were weak or its soldiers lacked courage. It failed because it tried to fight a modern industrial war with the resources of a second-tier power, led by a man more interested in glory than in truth. And so, the legacy of Mussolini's Italy is not one of triumph but of warning. It's a reminder that empires are not built on parades and speeches, but on the hard, unglamorous foundations of logistics, resources, and trust between leaders and people. When those are absent, even the boldest rhetoric crumbles at the first true test. Today, when Italy's role in the war is remembered mostly in jokes and internet memes, we risk forgetting the human cost. The soldiers who marched hungry, the families who endured bombings and shortages, the civilians caught in the firestorm of a civil war. Their suffering was real, even if Mussolini's empire was not. The dream of a new Rome ended not with banners unfurled over conquered lands, but with defeat, division, and disillusionment. It left behind no empire, no legacy of greatness, only a cautionary tale of how pride and impatience can destroy a nation. And that is perhaps the truest lesson of Mussolini's war.